Hi, class, and welcome to our first lecture. How this is going to work throughout the semester is I'm going to break down each lecture into different sections based on their theme. So, for example, for lecture one, I'll most likely have 3 or 4 parts. Hopefully, that makes it a little more digestible for you guys. So, I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to get right into it. So, starting with slide 1. Types and concepts of government. So we're really going to be talking about the theory and the definition of what government actually is and what government actually does. So as we're going over this today, let's try to answer these 2 questions. We will answer them pretty immediately. And those questions are, what is the primary role of government? And at its most basic level, what does government actually do? So if we had to break it down, we could probably categorize it into 3 different areas. What the government actually does. 1, they work for the good of the public by providing the essential goods and services such as water, freeways, sanitation, public education, etc. This list could be very, very long. It is the government's job to take care of things that maybe in this country, at least, we seem to take for granted. Paved roads to drive on, freeways, clean drinking water, free public education, etc. There are some things that are debated on whether or not they are public good, such as healthcare, things like that. But we'll get onto that later in the semester. But providing that basic infrastructure is generally a job of the government, of course, paid for by our tax dollars. 2, and perhaps the most important role, if we break it down, we boil it down, of the government, is to defend its citizens against foreign aggression. If the government can't defend its own territory, it really isn't worth much. And again, today, perhaps we take that for granted because we do live in the most peaceful time in recorded history, but that is still something that we spend a lot of money in this country to do. I mean, we'll talk more about military budget later, but we spend about $600 billion on our military a year. So a lot goes into that. And finally, 3, establishes law and maintains order. Make sure that the laws are being followed, and that would contribute to order, law and order, not just a great TV show, but also an important function of the government. Now, what we're going to go on to here is kind of the theoretical aspects of what government is or what government should be. And we're going to start with an Enlightenment thinker named Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes believed that human beings in the state of nature, that is, without government, will resort to a state of anarchy, meaning essentially it is everyone for themselves. Without government, there's really no order, there's really no law. It's really out of control. And I put a picture here, and this is a picture of Aleppo, Syria, which had a massive civil war. So a little bit different than just complete anarchy, but I think it still proves the point. Hobbes thinks we would devolve into situations like this with just mass chaos if we did not have government. Here's a picture of Thomas Hobbes, good-looking fellow. He's most famous perhaps for Leviathan, written in 1651, and his famous quote, "Life is nasty, brutish, and short." So definitely not the optimist was Thomas Hobbes. So to kind of recap, Thomas Hobbes believed that nature is anarchy. And again, not nature like deer and moose and trees. He means nature as in life without government. Human beings are cruel, mean, and brutish. In the state of nature, that is kind of our natural state. We are not generally good people, but there is hope. Human beings, through reason, we're the only animals, he might say, that have the ability to reason, can remove ourselves from nature. We are reasonable, therefore we might remove ourselves from nature and create what we call a government. So he believed that it is reasonable to do so. It is reasonable to transfer certain rights to a higher power in order to escape nature. Nature being, again, chaotic, cruel, mean, brutish. Okay. Government, therefore, and this is very important, government is a contract between the rulers and the ruled. Okay, so government becomes more strategic here. we're opening up the door, Hobbes is opening up the door to say, okay, government itself is a two-sided contract. You have the people being ruled and the ruler. Okay, and this is really revolutionary work, and along with other Enlightenment thinkers, that changes just the idea of preordained government, the idea that, okay, we have a king, queen, why is it like that? Just because it is, it's always been that way. He actually gets into the theory of why we have this government being a two-party consenting contract, essentially. Now, here's the thing about Hobbes, and I asked this question in the lecture sides: what type of government would Hobbes recommend to remove us from the state of nature? And maybe the answer would protect you, but let's talk a little bit more about Hobbes. Now, Hobbes's biggest fear was dying a violent death, okay? So when he theorized the idea of giving up certain rights and liberties in exchange for government, he's really talking about giving up those rights and liberties in exchange for protection. So to Hobbes, the biggest role of the government was to protect its citizens. That's the contract we just talked about. I, or you, the citizen, gives up some rights and liberties to this higher power, this sovereign authority. In exchange for that sovereign authority, in his case, a king or a queen, they protect us. So we're giving up rights to be protected by the government. So knowing that his biggest concern was to be protected from violence, it follows that the type of government he might recommend is that of one high authority, a king or a queen, right? The reason being, if there's some sort of incidents or some sort of violence, someone invades the country, the king or the queen or the ruler, whoever, the authoritarian, whoever it might be, can make instant, fast decisions and perhaps better protect the individual. Is everything else going to be better in that type of government? Maybe not. But, Hobbes' idea is that you'll at least be protected from the state of nature. So he would probably recommend a monarchy. So our first Enlightenment thinker was Thomas Hobbes. Let's move on to our next Enlightenment thinker. And again, we're talking about the theory behind government, is John Locke. Okay, and Locke comes briefly after Hobbes, and he has a little bit of a different idea about human nature and the purpose of government. So he does talk about many of the same ideas as Locke. He never as Hobbes. He never mentions him by name, but he does expand and refute some of his ideas. And he disagrees fundamentally on human nature of human beings. He doesn't agree that human beings are nasty, mean, and brutish, right? He actually believes we're pretty calm and rational, okay? So he disagrees on the premise. Being honest and civil is natural in human beings. So if Locke disagrees with Hobbes on the very nature of human beings, he must disagree also on the purpose of government. Because again, remember, Hobbes says we need government to protect ourselves from other people and ourselves, essentially, because human beings are terrible people. If we remove that belief that human beings are terrible people, it follows that you don't need protection then. So Locke has a different idea about human nature, and therefore a different idea about what the purpose of government is. He doesn't say government needs to be around to make sure people are good, because people are already generally good. Okay, so then therefore, the government sticks around for a different reason. The government, according to John Locke, is around for two reasons. One, to protect private property. He was very big on private property. And two, to protect natural rights. Okay, people can generally take care of themselves. All right, so let's just summarize. Hobbes believes people are bad. Therefore, we make a contract with the government to protect ourselves from other people. Locke thinks people are generally good. Therefore, we don't need the government to protect ourselves. Rather, we need the government to protect our individual rights and our right to own property. And I think this brings up a really interesting topic, and that is whether or not human beings are bad in the state of nature. So let's kind of do a little thought experiment here. And this is actually going to be your discussion question for this week, week 2, okay? Now, do you guys agree here with Thomas Hobbes or John Locke? Let's say tomorrow, every government in the entire world just shut down operations, said, we're closing shop, we're done. Do you think that the world would end up in a state of anarchy? People just killing, stealing, and murdering each other, whatever it might be? Or do you think generally that people would get along and life would maybe go on relatively the same? And I think there's a case to be made for both Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Let's take a look at your discussion post this week, because I think it's very interesting. Question one is essentially asking you what I just did, who you agree with. But question two, I think, really gets into the detail of what we're talking about. And that is, I ask right here on question two, would you kill a random person for $1 billion if there was no way you could get caught? Let's say there's no possible physical way you could get caught. You're getting a free pass. If you kill this person, you press a button and they die. You don't know them. And you get $1 billion, life-changing, generation-changing money. You'll never have to work a day in your life. Would you press that button? That's what we have to kind of ask ourselves, I think. And I think it's a really good question because it kind of exposes human nature. I'm assuming a lot of you maybe are tempted to say, yes, I would press a button, kill a random person painlessly for $1 billion, right? Would that not go to more what Hobbes thinks about human nature? We're kind of all in it for ourselves and we'll take what we need, even if it kills someone else. However, if you answer, no, you wouldn't do it, maybe you agree with John Locke more. Maybe you think, no, I'm a person, I have whatever my concept of morality is, which is a whole different discussion, and I would not kill for money. So I think there's a lot to be said there. And try to think about it. Who do you agree with, Thomas Hobbes or John Locke, on whether people are generally good or bad? Okay, so let's keep going here, back to the slides. John Locke says people are born with certain inalienable rights that should not be taken from them. Now, the key word here, inalienable. Now, what does that mean? That means essentially you are born with those rights. People are born with rights that should not be taken from them by anyone, including the government. Now, again, we're talking about the contract here. He calls it a social contract. Again, where Hobbes talks about the contract, we're giving up rights for protection. Where Locke talks about the contract, we're still giving up certain freedoms to the government. That's unavoidable, right? You can't do, if you live in the United States, you can't do whatever you want. You can't go 110 down the freeway. You can't murder people. You can't steal. There are rules. You're giving up certain freedoms to do what you want in exchange for certain things. So again, for Hobbes, it's for protection. For Locke, he calls a social program, we're giving up freedoms in exchange for protection of rights. Not our body, but our rights, okay? One of the things that I love about John Locke that he says is revolution is not only a natural right, but at times an obligation. And think for a second what he means by that. He's essentially saying that this really is a contract. If the government breaks its end of the social contract, revolution, rebelling against the government, is not only your right, it's an obligation. Think about it like this. Let's say that you started a new job and you've been working there for about a year, and they all of a sudden stop paying you. Okay, well, on your first day of that job, you signed a contract. I'll work these hours in exchange for this pay. If they stop paying you, they're breaking their end of the contract. Therefore, that contract is void. You quit, right? It's essentially what John Locke is saying. If the government doesn't hold up their end of the deal, and in his theory and social contract, that end of the deal is protecting your natural rights, then you are free to leave because that contract is voided. And not only should you, but it should be an obligation to you to protect your rights. That's how important they are.